All right, good evening and welcome once again to the final session of the 9th Annual San Juan Islands Agricultural Summit. And thank you all so much for joining us throughout this event and for being here with us this evening. My name is Brooke Brower. I'm the director of the Washington State University San Juan County Extension Office here in San Juan Island and San Juan County, and be your host for this evening's keynote. So we're almost a month into this opportunity to learn and reflect, and hopefully in some small ways, actually connect with one another and build some new relationships. I know that for me personally, this content has been inspiring, challenging, emotional, at times tragic, and at times joyous. As we roll full tilt into spring, I know these messages, conversation, and words will continue to echo and grow. I've been greatly inspired to see these ideas already ripping out into the community through our participants. So I'd like to just pause for a moment so that we can focus on being here this evening and listening. We recognize and honor all peoples who have ancestral ties to these lands and waters. We recognize and honor our ancestors and all those living who have contributed their labor, experience, and knowledge to growing food and nourishing communities. We recognize the importance of amplifying the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And with great gratitude, we welcome and thank the speakers and participants from these communities who have been sharing their knowledge, experience, and wisdom as part of this event. While acknowledging historic and current injustices, we wish to move from acknowledgement to practice. It is our hope this event has offered a next step in building relationships, educating, and creating space for voices that have been silenced, marginalized, and excluded from local food and agricultural conversations. And that, I do want to take a moment also to thank our sponsors and partners who have helped facilitate and make this event possible and help us offer the Ag Summit year after year. So I'd like to thank the Land Bank, Oak Knoll Farm, Skagit Farmers Supply, Taproot Farm, Sunset Builders, Peter Schmidt Construction, Orcas Food Co-op, San Juan Islands Makers Guild, Friday Harbor Film Fest, Islanders Insurance, Orca Song Institute, Lopez Locavores, and Rural Roots, and also the many partners who have been involved in this. In particular, the steering committee, and Sam Barr, and Caitlin Leck, Sam Dillingham, Reese Torvald Hansen, Catherine Bryant Ingman, Steph Coffey, Faith Vandeput, as well as Kate Mikulik. And I'd also just like to again say a very special thank you to Kate for not only inspiring the theme of this year's Ag Summit, but being an absolute driving force and implementation from start to finish. So thank you so much, Kate. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you on the team and leading the charge. And also special thanks to Wendy Waxman and Walton Andrews from our office. Just one more last Zoom reminder. You've all been through this enough times, but if you can please keep yourself muted. The session is going to be recorded so that you'll be able to view it later. I'll ask you to hold your questions and put them in the chat near the end of the presentation. And you'll also be receiving an evaluation, so please fill that out. The one thing we are going to do a little bit differently this evening is we're going to have a moment. We're going to put you all into breakout rooms, and there'll be opportunity to unmute and actually share and talk to one another. So really looking forward to that, and that should be a nice opportunity to interact a bit. And finally, and this is as we think about moving these conversations out into our community, reminding you to actively listen and honor the experiences that others have lived. We will create a space that allows for learning and growth. And if we are someone who speaks easily, we will think about moving into a listening role. And if we listen easily, we move up into a speaking role. We have grace with each other and will acknowledge its mistakes and commit to change. Like that, it's my incredible honor to introduce A-dae Briones, who was born and raised in Cochiti Pueblo, New Mexico, and comes from the Toycoya Maltese family from Hog Creek, Oklahoma on the Kiowa side. A-dae works as directors of programs at Native Food and Agriculture Program for First Nations Development Institute. She has written extensively about food safety, the produce safety rule for tribes, and the protection of tribal traditional foods. As a U.S. Fulbright scholar, A-dae received her Bachelor of Arts in Public Policy from Princeton University, received a Juris Doctorate from Arizona State University of Law, and LLM in Food and Agricultural Law from the University of Arkansas. President Obama recognized A-dae as a White House champion of change in agriculture, and she formerly served on the National Organic Standards Board and the Sustainable Ag and Food System Funders Policy Committee. And I just want to say that on a personal note, A-dae has been an absolute delight to work with in preparing for this presentation. She's been such an engaged participant in many of the sessions, reached out and asked questions, and just has such a wonderful, gracious presence. So thank you so much in participating, and so excited to have you close out this year's summit. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Brooke. And gosh, it's been a month. I don't know what I'm gonna do with my evenings and my Tuesday evenings and my Sunday afternoons not being with everyone in the different sessions. It's been an honor. So let's get started. You can see my screen? Okay, great.
Perfect.
Perfect. First things first, Juan, again, we've been together for a month. Like, how incredible and generous the world has been with us to spend this much time together and to have so many wonderful speakers and insights. I was telling Brooke and Kate, like, I really, gosh, I know the islands, like I study them on the map. I've heard stories of the people. I've heard about organizations that work in this place, and it's a really magical place, not only from the stories that the Indigenous people shared in the sessions, but even from the agricultural community and the organizations that care about food and how it's distributed in this particular region. I would be, in Indigenous cultures, you open a session or a gathering, you have an opening and you have an end. So Guatsi se hopa hin wakat ni me asat wat yats kukite ma osabta koi mahoda. We'll get into my introduction, but before I even begin, like, I recognize some of the Indigenous people that I have been privileged to listen to in the last couple weeks, and Sam Barr, like, really just, I can't say enough about how much knowledge and information he shared with the group. Patty and Andrew from Tulalip, their words still ring in my mouth. Ring in my head and come out of my mouth. Marco and Rosie. Jamie is one of our longtime grantees at First Nations. So is Jamestown. And of course, all the tribal people of the islands and the surrounding area, but also to you all, the people of the islands, whether you came recently or 5 generations in, like, in my language, there's a distinction between the people of the land, which really has no color. If you are of the land, you are of the land. And so I recognize you as well. And I leave this with my heart full. I also told Kate and Brooke that coming into this, my idea of extension was much different than how I'm leaving. One of the most important workshops that I went to, Dr. Zimbabwe talked about the history of extension, and I left that session thinking, like, wow, this is what we're participating was formed by extension, and it's offering hope and a new way and new vision for people to practice food production and land relationship. And again, I'm thankful for that. So we'll get started. I'm from Cochiti and I'm Kiowa, and much of what I know, I thank Brooke for reading that very long bio, but really when it comes down to it, we are of people of the land, and where we grow up and the people who surround us are the ones who really have that formation of the principles and the values that we will always return to. And so these are the people and the land that formed me. My grandma is actually, my great-great-grandma is the little baby that's being held. And I'm incredibly thankful. And I'll get into some of the lessons that they taught me later in the presentation after our activity together. But that's so, and I'm just going to return back to some of the things Sam said in many of his presentations, is that when we, as Indigenous people, when we come to the table, we introduce ourselves and the family and the lands that we are of, because that tells people like who we bring to the table. We not only bring ourselves and the knowledge or whatever life experiences we have personally, we have this long history of ancestral knowledge, burdens and strengths that are also at the table with us, like a long comet tail. And so when we introduce ourselves, we bring all those things to the table that goes as far back as the animals and the plants in our creation stories, and all that comes with us when we introduce ourselves. And I think that's a wonderful practice that centers, that not only centers everything that made you, it humbles you, because those are the things you bring to the table. And often we see that humbleness missing in agriculture, and especially mainstream agriculture. And so that's an Indigenous lesson that was reinforced often in the traditional foodways study groups. And now I live with my husband and my family in Northern California, who have a very similar food life way as those in the island communities. My husband is actually Native Hawaiian. And so we lived on the island of Lanai, and I have to tell you, island people to me are some of the most resourceful people. When you live on an island, you have borders, you're very conscious about what will wash up on shore, what won't, what you have to like haul on a boat or a ferry in order to get there. And so you're very conscious about your imprint on land. And I recognize that in many of the sessions that I participated in, is like, gosh, island life and island thought is really quite impressive. And island people have so much to teach the rest of mainland America. And I come from a landlocked land, a desert. So it was a great reinforcement. So what we're gonna cover today, and I will go to about 8 o'clock or a little over. We're gonna do some hands-on activities. We're gonna discuss patterns, and then we're going to apply these to our American food system and agricultural food systems, and then we'll bring it back to like call to action. What can we do as not only participants in American food systems, but what can the people of the San Juan Islands do to really start bridging some of these very big gaps that we see in food systems in not only America, but along the West Coast, and just, I would say, gaps in our heart about how we have our relationships with not only land, but food and each other, which is much needed at this very tumultuous time in our history together. So with that, if everyone could find a paper and a pen, we're going to do our hands-on activity. And bear with me. well, we try to do this virtually, but if you have a pen and paper handy, I'm going to give everyone 3 minutes. I'm going to start my timer and I want you to just doodle. Doodle a pattern that is in just doodle a pattern. Very simple. Draw something that you like, a pattern, some kind of pattern. And in 3 minutes, I will ask you to stop and we will share out those patterns and where they come from in a small group. So with that, we 3 minutes to draw. Please get your hands moving. If you have to stand up to draw, do it, but get moving. 3 minutes. Timer's on. Okay, so as everyone's completing the pattern, we're gonna send you out to breakout rooms. And I will put the 3 questions into chat, which is, why did you choose this pattern? Where did this pattern come from? And when you see this pattern, what are you reminded of? Aloha, everybody is returning. And I wasn't privy to many of the breakout rooms, but I would love to see your patterns. If you could like hold them up to the Zoom camera so I can see these patterns, I would be entirely grateful. Oh my gosh, some of them are beautiful. I love the squiggly. Oh my gosh. Beautiful. Awesome.
Ugly.
Kevin, I want to be your friend. That was wonderful. Ooh, the spiral. Oh my gosh, these are wonderful. Thank you so much for doing that with me. I'm going to share my screen now so we can continue with the presentation. But I want you all to remember what patterns you had and why you chose that, and remember what your hands felt like making those patterns and what you see and what you're reminded of. That's really important. Really, really, really important. Okay. Why did we go through this pattern exercise? Because patterns are how we see the world, and how we implement or perpetuate those patterns are how the world sees us. And in honor of Sam, again, I'm one of Sam's biggest fans now. There's a lot of important things happening in this world, and there's a lot of folks reaching out to Indigenous people. But one of the most important pattern that I was taught as an Indigenous person growing up in a very traditional home is that you don't go into other people's territories without first acknowledging the people and letting them know you're there. In Hawaii, we have very elaborate chants and calls that announces our arrival, just so the people who steward those lands know that you are in their territory and that you are there and you have good intentions. In the Kiowa tribe, when somebody came into our territory without announcing themselves, it was a sign of war, so they would go to war. And that is a very important pattern that was practiced in Indigenous America throughout the mainland. And again, so as an Indigenous person who comes from a different territory, like I honor Sam and the Tulalip people, the Squamish people, the Skigit people, all the people who come from this land. And it's a very important pattern. And when we think about the Indigenous experience in this country, when the government took people from their homelands and placed them in other people's homelands, and did that and continues to do that, whether it be with reservations or whether it be with relocation, like we still are trying to return to the pattern where we are allowed to give due respect to the Indigenous people who steward the lands, whether or not they are there now or not. And so Sam is from Lopez Island. And so I just wanted to say that very quickly before we got too far deep in the presentation. So one more exercise with one another before we continue on with like the bulk of the presentation. What is the pattern you see here? And I guess we can do it in chat. I can't see chat, but Or if somebody just wants to unmute and say what the pattern is, please say what the pattern is. Or I can tell you. Go ahead, I heard somebody.
I think all the letters in the top row have straight lines and all the ones in the bottom row have curves in them.
Absolutely, yay, yes. So whoever said that, I can't see you on my screen. There's too many screens going on here, but yes, absolutely. It's the straight lines versus the squiggly lines. And you know, this exercise is actually given to some of our Indigenous children who are 2 to 3 years old prior to going to Head Start, and they get this very easily. Like this is, I think there was a 98% rate of identifying the pattern with Indigenous people, Indigenous children before they went to school. And after they went to school, the pattern was not so recognizable. And I say this because I grew up with a mother who focused, she's a doctorate, she has a doctorate in the socialization of Indigenous children. And much of what I know about our food systems and Indigenous communities really comes from a lot of her work. And this is her and I dancing the corn dance in our community. But really, when we talk about the socialization of Indigenous children, we have so much to learn from our children and so much to learn from the way they think. And actually, much of my presentation comes from children who are 2 to 3 years old. When we talk about environment and food systems, much of this came from their insight. And so again, you know, growing up in an Indigenous community, many of us were apt to drawing pictures, making pots, participating in art projects that had like some of these patterns, right? And what this, my grandma was a potter. These are some of the patterns she used in her pots. These pots are not hers, but from relatives in different communities. And these are the things we grew up drawing as children. And you know, when we go to school, many of Indigenous children, there's a high rate of special education where Indigenous, high rates of special ed Indigenous education attendance, because Indigenous children are not apt to, you know, doing well on tests sometimes. But we're often told, as I was told in school, like, but you're a really good artist or you're a really good musician. And I always resented that actually. But really, like, our Indigenous children are bringing these skills to many of the educational institutions or any institution that they're participants in. Agriculture is an institution in America. And so it took me a very long time, but understanding that these skills that Indigenous children were bringing to very well-established institutions like an education system, like an agricultural system, prepares them to actually identify the cycles of that system. And so I didn't know this until I went to college and I was in an economics class and I didn't get it. I didn't understand what the professor was telling me. I didn't understand micro and macro. I just didn't understand GDP. It was really hard. And so until he started showing the graphs of economic cycles. And then I said, you know what, wait, I've seen some of these things. I've seen these things, whether it be, and I started recognizing the patterns both in like physics, especially in the sciences, and especially in the environmental courses. In the economics courses, I started recognizing the patterns. And so when we look at what Indigenous children are bringing to these institutions, the question becomes like, when do we start losing these? When do we start changing how how we view the world, and recognizing these patterns and these cycles that are so integral to us understanding how the world works. And then my mom said, well, you know, you just have to, when you go to a new place, like when I got married, it's really important you understand and you observe and you participate with the indigenous people in their traditional activities, and you'll start recognizing what's really important in that environment. And this is my current home with my husband and my children who are Big Valley Pomo. You start to recognize that, you know, like this woodpecker is actually, you know, a keystone species in our place. Like this is really important to not only the propagation of acorns and oak trees, but they also propagate bay nuts. And you see this in almost every indigenous community. This is Northern California and Yurok. You know, some of them are actually up in Southern Oregon. You start to see what's really important to these environments based on what the indigenous people are providing in not only their artwork, but in their song and dance, but it's most visible in some of the art that's being sold, being created by indigenous artists, often outside of like mainstream markets, but also in mainstream markets. This is actually a really popular artist who sells her stuff on Instagram, but this is like, the pattern is the sturgeon, you know, and the acorn has the butterfly pattern and the obsidian. These are all very important geological and environmental species and patterns that ensure that they watch and they understand that their environments are healthy. And so when of course, when I started participating in this sessions, you know, I had to look at some of, and Sam was so gracious to actually focus on this topic in one of the sessions, is like, look at the carvings, look at what the art of indigenous people are telling us. What are they seeing? What's important to them? And of course, the salmon is a critically important species. The number of salmon is really important to understanding what's happening in the environment. And once that's like the base of like, this is where you find information. And of course, I focus on this now because many times when indigenous people are told, oh, well, you're a great artist, it's a way of separating that person from their environment, or actually a knowledge carrier or an environmental steward, because somehow it's less than the science that you may pick up in a book or that may be perpetuated in an academic institution, when in reality it's not. It's actually just as important. And you can go to an academic institution and learn about carbon cycles. You can read a book about soil fertility. But I wanted to share something which was shared with me in all the indigenous foodways, that there are also bodies of knowledge that are really important to this conversation, that have validity and have actually very important historical reference points that also should be included in the conversations when we talk about agriculture, environmental health, environmental stewardship. And it's found in the indigenous art and with the indigenous people. And so, you know, one of the things that's become like a buzzword in agriculture recently is regenerative agriculture. And I've gotten asked many times, well, what do indigenous people know about regenerative agriculture? And so like, I show them this pot. This is like a pot that's pretty common in many households. Is, you know, cows were introduced, and I have a whole presentation on cattle colonialism and how that's displaced a lot of indigenous people, a lot of native species. And, you know, we have to think about the role of the cow in some of our systems. But when indigenous people talk about regenerative agriculture, the way regenerative agriculture talks about the cow, you know, we have elk species, we have deer species. And when we look at some of the art coming out of the Midwest and the Great Plains area, we see a lot of buffalo. And so like this concept of carbon recycling is not a new thing. Maybe we didn't count carbon molecules with microscopes in indigenous communities, but we understood carbon cycles. And it was very much part of what we did as indigenous people when we had food production, and we created ways of creating the balanced relationship with our environments and people. So when we look at some of like the research that's coming out around soil fertility, you know, we have maps like this. And I found this map critically fascinating. It's really hard to see the colors, but basically the dark purple is where some of the most fertile soils in America are today. And these maps always kind of drive me crazy because they never have the islands on, right? Like, where's Hawaii? Where's Alaska? But where's San Juan Islands in this? But that's beside the point for now. Some of the most fertile lands in America are actually places that were stewarded by indigenous people. And when you look, actually, this is a fun fact, when you look in New Mexico and you see the purple dots, those are actually very important places to indigenous people and still have indigenous people. So the purple and the pink are probably reservations currently. And so when we look at the soil drainage index, and of course I had the reference, if you want to look up these maps like bigger and actually play with them, it's really fun. You know, waterways are pretty important. That's a given, right? Waterways are, you live in islands. I think the San Juan Island people understand that waterways are critically important to soil fertility in ways that probably mainland folks don't understand that. But I wanted to show this maps because, you know, it's a recognized concept that land is connected to water. And if you think of any indigenous story, almost every indigenous story I've heard about food and creation has land and water as critically important parts. The element that's often missing in mainstream culture is fire. Water, land, fire, these are the elements that are supposed to be at the table consistently. And so when I talk about these concepts and this art, like I get so fascinated because it's a beautiful way of transmitting knowledge. And when an indigenous people sees artwork from another indigenous tribe, it's like reading a book. It's like, oh, I kind of understand. This is coming from the Salmon Nation. This means that these people, that the keystone species is probably salmon, and that this is something that drives people and moves people. So when we hear things from like Sam that says, you know, when we talk about agriculture, and this was before coming into this session, we had many discussions about what would be relevant and important to the audience. And Sam reiterated in many, is like when we talk about agriculture and farms, to us tribal people, what we saw looked more like logging. Or Andrew Gobin in his presentation, he said there's a stigma around agriculture. It was used as a tool to civilize, and it was used to remove us from our lands. So how, you know, so the question is like this institution of agriculture, and we all, it's really a beautiful thing. I come from a people who have been agriculturalists for generations. But you know, when America first settled, we weren't considered agriculturalists. We weren't considered farmers. And so really when we think about how agriculture is framed in the mainstream, its very roots exclude entire groups of people. Its very roots were used to separate people from their land. And so the challenge we have currently is to think about reframing and actually creating new stories about agriculture that look and reflect what we wanted to. When I talk about how important this session was to me, it helped me reframe how I thought about extension. And in the same vein and in the same logic, we have to reframe how we talk about agriculture. So it's not a painful thing to some of the indigenous people. And when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we can't just focus on the cow eating the grass and sequestering carbon, right? Because one of the critical important elements that we don't discuss are like how waterways are altered, how dams have been put up so that like natural waterways are no longer carrying the same nutrients they once did to the very fertile parts of our country. We have to talk about like logging. You know, trees are critically important to soil fertility and soil moisture. And so when we talk about these things are often not included in the conversations about regenerative agriculture or agriculture. It's almost like the point in time where we start the discussion is when the plot of land was fenced in, which is we're missing an entire conversation where many of indigenous people are still sitting and still thinking about, because we're still seeing the effects of these critical activities in this part of history. And in California, and I'm sure it's the same in the islands, like part of the soil fertility came from these critically important species like salmon would go up the river and come, you know, die after they laid their eggs, and their bodies became the soil eventually. And I'll tell you, Sam blew my mind because he said, literally, all these islands are the soil is the bones of my ancestors. And he went through the entire conversations about how long bones last, where indigenous people were buried, and how they become part of the soil, which we now walk on. And so in the same way, salmon have done the same thing. And so these fertile soils that we take for granted are actually built in probably the part of agriculture history that we often negate to talk about. And so when we're talking about agriculture in indigenous communities, like, boy, it's like, it's a heavy conversation. And when actually, when President Obama recognized me as agriculture change maker in agriculture, I can't remember the title. I was actually pretty ashamed because I was like, what are all these indigenous people going to think of me? Because, you know, agriculture doesn't have the same kind of you know, status in indigenous communities that it may have in other parts of America. So it was both a blessing and a curse. And I'm appreciative, but again, like, I think about Sam, I think about Andrew, and I think about their reactions. Like, it's not always a happy conversation. And we're finding more and more when we talk about agriculture, mainstream agriculture, it's a similar reaction. And so when we think, again, we're thinking about agriculture and how does this indigenous story fit into how we think about agriculture. Really, we're in the fourth agricultural revolution. I'm sure, and there's industries that are vying for, like, not industries, like groups of people within agriculture who are sort of vying for that title. So the first agricultural revolution was when, and this is the part that gets me, when hunters and gatherers went to agriculture. Well, you know, like, if you heard Marco Hatch or you heard Rosie speak, like, there's really not a time where, like, hunter-gatherers became agriculturalists, because some of the practices of, like, incipient domestication, they call it proto-agriculture, really, like, those are still practices. Some people call it, like, tending the wild, but really these are practices of indigenous people practicing agriculture in ways that that work with nature as opposed to control nature. And there's never actually been an era where those activities became agriculture for many communities. We still have people who are dependent on salmon. We still have people who are clam guarding. We still have people who are collecting seaweed. And it's not like, but we're not cavemen. And so that's part of like the whole era and agricultural history that we really need to re-examine. The second revolution was the mechanization of agriculture. When we think of the tractor and the combustion engine, and actually there's legislation that was given from extension. This is part of where the history, like I have to re-examine and I really have to think about, is when tractors became a thing, Indigenous people were offered tractors if they would send their kids to school, to boarding school. So it was like, we'll give you a tractor, you can participate in the mechanization of agriculture, but you have to send your kids to boarding school, which was like, I just can't even imagine. And then the third agricultural revolution was really the green revolution, where we see GE and pesticide science really become dominant in mainstream agriculture. And again, Native people were absent from this because there's a notion that Indigenous people don't do science. Now we have this thing called TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. But still, when we talk about that, that's like a very broad term, when really like we're talking about local and regional stewardship practices. I understand Kochiti worldview and knowledge that is directly connected to a place, and this similar for every Indigenous community in this country. We are tied to a place. So traditional ecological knowledge is like a broad pen term that kind of describes all these things, but really we're talking about regional land stewardship practices by specific people over very long periods of time. So when we talk about the fourth agricultural revolution, this is where you and I and everybody who is practicing in food production has a stake in what and how history views us. So there's an opening for us to create a narrative that not only like maybe re-examines every agricultural revolution before us, but we have the ability to craft the narrative of what this fourth agricultural revolution is. And I hope and beg and pray that like Indigenous stories, Indigenous artwork, Indigenous practices are included when we think about agriculture. And so I just, like I said, I'm from the Southwest, I'm Kiowa, and we're talking about a critically important place, the San Juan Islands. Sam described it as the nexus point. Andrew, I think, said, it's the place, or Sam said it's the place of 1,000 canoes. Like it was a very important trade place for Indigenous people. And that has a lot of connotations and implications for what these islands mean currently. And so I just wanted to take some time to hear the words from Patty Gobin, like whose words still ring in my head. If you didn't have a chance to see this presentation, I wanted to give everybody the opportunity now. And so I'm going to stop sharing so we can hear Patty's words directly.
And I always say it very respectfully that I didn't come from Adam and Eve. My grandmother, long before I was human, was a cedar tree. And that's from up in the mountains.
I'm sorry, we're having a quick issue here. Let me try that again. Okay, I'm gonna try one more time.
Stories of where we came from. And I always say it very respectfully that I didn't come from Adam and Eve. My grandmother, long before I was human, was a cedar tree. And that's from up in the mountains. That's my grandmother. My grandfather was King Salmon that came to Tulalip Bay and saw the little children, salmon, looking up out of the water, and they were just all huddled around. And those little children looked at Grandpa and said, Grandfather, we want to become human. The eagle is already transformed into human form. The ravens have transformed into human form. We want to be human form. We know that grandfather laid some conditions on those grandchildren, and it has been told generation after generation, and a lot of it was in the last 150, 200 years kept in quiet and in secret about that, because it was uncivilized to even think in that manner. But it was that whole connection to the earth, whether you be in human form, plant form, animal form, wildlife, everything was there, and we were all interconnected and related. They were our relatives and have a life of their own. Our people also believe, and I know I think we have a sister that's going to be speaking later from the First Nations. We know that every huckleberry bush has a song to it. They sing songs. We know that the cedar tree has its own song. I have my own song as a human form, that were songs that were given to our ancestors when they became human. And that's what we have in our salmon ceremony. But the condition for our ancestors to become human, like I am today, like Andrew, like our grandmother in this picture that was up picking huckleberries, and you see the land is already scarred, not from our ancestors, but from the trees being cut down and logged. The conditions for us becoming human is that once a year we come back to Tulalip Bay, and we don't tell them and talk to our ancestors, our grandfather, but we sing our songs to our grandfather. He said, I'm going to give you these songs because I won't know you by your human voice, your form, but I will know you by these songs I give you, because these songs are my songs. And those are the songs we sing today. And he says, and when you come here, I want you to give me a report, your grandfather. These are the conditions for you becoming human, that you will come here and you will tell me how you're treating your human relatives, the eagle, the raven, the snake, the blue jay, the bear. You will tell me how you're treating them, if you're being respectful, because I know how you treat your people under the Salish Sea in the big house down there, because I'm your grandfather and I watch carefully how you treat and how you're being raised to be respectful. And he says, the other condition is I want to know how you're treating this earth that you live on. And I want to know how you're treating it as human beings. Again, I know how you treat the Salish Sea and your relatives under the Salish Sea, the seaweed, the eel grass. Those are all your relations. We're all intertwined. I know how you treat them, but I want to report how you're treating every living thing outside of the water, and that you're taking care of it and being respectful. And he said, the other thing is, I want to know how you're treating all your relations, how you're working together with all your relations, the birds, the bees, the bears, the deer, the elk, the Swinomish, the Lummi, the Samish, the Stilly, the Suquamish, in all our relations, Neutronos, all of us. How are you treating them? I know how you treat your relatives under the Salish Sea. He said, if you cease to do this, to come back to me every spring when the monarch butterfly appears, you know it's time to come and give me your report as human beings, my grandchildren. And he said, if you cease to do this, you will cease to exist as a people. And so,
Okay, so I'm gonna get back to my screen. But that story is like the story of the islands. And I think about the people singing the salmon song, and it's the song for the land. It's the song for soil fertility. It's the song that keeps those lands healthy. And so when I think about some of the most critical agricultural conversations today, I often see Indigenous people pitted against farmers for the access to water, when in reality, we are in the same conversation. We are offering the same songs to the same land that we want this land healthy. And oftentimes when there's money involved, you know, people get pitted against one another, you know, and nobody really wins. And I'm gonna end with not only thanking Patty, but thanking all the Indigenous people who shared their stories. I can't say enough about Sam, and I feel really hopeful because everybody who participated in these sessions know who these people are. They know, they see their faces. They can probably find them. Sam is native to Lopez Island. And I think like you are all in great hands. And the question that we should be asking ourselves is, how are we helping and supporting these groups of people to sing that salmon song daily? And imagine a time and a place where the clam beds are healthy, where people have farms and they're feeding the community, including Indigenous communities. And they're singing these songs together on all the shores of the islands, to all the waters, and that the salmon are returning to a great feast that we all contribute to. And that's really the question that will change how the narrative plays out in this fourth revolution of agriculture. And we all have a part to play. And so I think I leave you in the hands of these beautiful Indigenous people. And I hope that this whole 1 month together like gives you the courage to actually reach out and to talk to them and to learn more about their stories and learn about more about the places they come from, and learn about the all the elements that will help them sing their songs. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, A-dae. That was beautiful. We're very fortunate now to have some time for questions if you're up for it. So if people want to go ahead and start thinking about questions they have and put them into the chat, we can read those out as they come in. I think I have one maybe to just get us started, why people think a little bit about it. And you know, I think it takes a moment to reflect and let all that sink in. So thank you again. I was thinking about patterns when you were talking earlier, and just kind of curious if you if you have patterns in mind that you can envision in sort of food and agriculture moving forward, or do you see patterns that you can imagine and in the future that you would like to see?
Absolutely. So, and this may seem so elementary to people, but it still amazes me. And so here's, okay, you see two patterns here, right? One's the square and one's the circle, which is one that somebody showed on their screen. And really, those are the two patterns that describe the current era we're in, right? The square pattern, the idea of row crops, like that's what we all picture in the conversation around agriculture, when in reality, probably the circle should probably what we're aiming for. And I'll give you an example. My grandfather, one of the other Indigenous teachings is like, sometimes you don't recognize the knowledge that's given to you until you're ready. And so I remember in my own community, we had, when I was 5 years old, we had an influx of elk, and they came and ate all the corn, and it was really devastating. I remember my grandmother crying because we worked so hard. I mean, if you're a farmer and you grow this corn and then it's wiped out by the elk, it's pretty devastating. It's like losing your kids. We were all devastated. My grandpa didn't wink. And I asked him, I was like, Grandpa, Papa, why are you so, what's up? Why are you so nonchalant about this? Why don't we put up a fence so all the elk won't eat our corn? And he stopped me and said, A-dae, that's not how this works. Like, we don't grow for just us. Like, when the elk come from the mountain, they're bringing us a message from those mountains that are saying that something's not right up there. And so when we keep them out and we put up these fences, we're cutting off that communication. So they may have ate all our corn, but we don't grow food for just us. We're part of this larger cycle. And so this little plot of land that we farm is part of that cycle. It's not just this plot, it's part of this entire cycle that we have to consider. And so, like, I didn't remember that until like a year ago when we were talking about fences. And in reality, Extension in the 1940s bought, like, I think 100 yards of fencing for my community, and it's still there. Nobody put up fences. And so when I think about patterns in agriculture, like, those are the symbols for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Lots of gratitude in the chat here. One question from Catherine Gardot, and said, not knowing about your award from President Obama, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about why you were honored and why it didn't feel good, if that's something you'd feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I was honored because I think, of course, I don't know why, it's always a political decision to get honored by, like, that kind of organ, by the president. And so I think one of the reasons was, like, I've always been a strong advocate about food safety. And of course, that's like on everybody's mind, especially if you're selling in the market. But one of the critical elements of food safety that I think is often missing in agriculture is this idea of time. Like, there's such a need to fit into growing seasons, to fit into timelines where bacteria don't grow. Like, our concept of time in agriculture is really, really short, usually limited to a few weeks, whether it be like how we fertilize our fields, whether it be how we package our products and how long they can stay in the refrigerator. Like, our timelines are really short. And so the work I really wanted to focus on was this idea of generational. When we talk 7 generations, Sam is the 7th generation. I'm actually 6th generation. So my children are 7th generation in my community from contact. Like, this idea that it takes generations in order to fully develop into whatever we're going to be. So when we think about bacteria and microbiome, it's going to probably take 7 generations for like our bodies to accommodate whatever is in our environment now. But food safety, when we think about food safety and like Clorox and steel surfaces and like basically killing every living thing that is on that plant or in that environment so that people don't get sick, is ruining or like disconnecting that cycle of adaptation, so that when we look at food safety, it doesn't really, it's not an accurate picture. Like we're actually probably limiting how we think of food safety by constantly relying on stainless steel and like Clorox wipes, basically. And it was uncomfortable again because it's agriculture, right? I had a quote from Andrew Goldman where he said, you know, like agriculture is a stigma. It's the thing that was used to civilize us. And so when I come from a very traditional community, I work with traditional people in indigenous food systems, and I'm being recognized by the American government as a champion of agriculture. I was like, oh no, oh my gosh. That's not always like the best place to be in. But you know, it's been helpful, yes. So thank you for asking that.
Great, thank you. Another question from Kelly here is, how do we strike a balance between respecting the privacy of Indigenous knowledge and learning about it and advocating for it so that it can form our work in the food and agricultural systems?
And I don't think that's limited to just like Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. Like I began the presentation by acknowledging like I'm not from these lands, and that like I honor the people who are from these lands and have been stewarding them for generations, whether or not they've been displaced from their homelands or not. Like there are folks who still sing songs, there are folks who still do cedar ceremonies. And like I recognize that. America's society is not good at recognizing that. Partly is because the institutions we set up, like the legal system, says like if you have a mortgage title or a property title that's recorded first, like you are the beginning. That's basically like how property works in America. But in Indigenous cultures, like you have to recognize the people who are on those, who have stewarded those lands. And like that is a form of humbleness, and you start the conversation from there. And so like when I see this idea of land acknowledgement, it's really important, but you kind of have to take it one step further and say like, if they're not here, why are they not here? And how can I create access so that they are here? So it's like, we're on the right path. We do have to create practices that allow relationships to bloom. And we have to humble ourselves to people who may have been displaced from these lands. Like we have to give them that due respect. And the other thing is like, we have to make relationships with people. Like it's really awkward to go into somebody's house and not know them. Like there's always that era or that time of like uncomfortableness until you get to the point where you can have conversations. And that's going to be a learning pain for everyone, Indigenous people included. And so I say like, be brave, don't be scared to be rejected at times. And you know, the journey is going to be a rough one, but it shouldn't deter us from actually making those first steps.
Thank you. And yeah, so appreciate your graciousness and thinking about how to navigate through all of this and realize it continued challenge. Kate's wondering if you would be willing to share a little bit more about the foodways and food production of your family.
Oh my gosh.
Or do we need to do another whole hour?
But I will say
or a week?
Quick commentary is yeah, I grew up in an indigenous Cochiti Pueblo. So like most of the community was subsistence farmers until they put this big dam on our reservation that ended up like flooding all of our agriculture fields. But we are like from the Corn Nation. Sam and Marco and Patty, they're all from the from the Salmon Nation. I'm from the Corn Nation. And so we have this reverence for corn, which is a whole nother webinar on like corn production in America. But we're subsistence farmers, and the subsistence title, like we hear that a lot with Alaska Natives and then Pueblo farmers and maybe some people in the Pacific Northwest. Like that's kind of a misnomer, because subsistence, when you put it in economic terms, is really that point of like bare minimum, and everything above that point can be commodified and used for profit. So when they say subsistence, it really is not a good description of the communities and lifeways, because it's really beautiful. And I think island people would know this the best. Like it's about relationship and balance with the capacity of the environment and the land, as opposed to like a subsistence living. It's really about balance. And if we as human beings have to curb our desires and wants in order for our environments to thrive, like we have to understand the land to do that. So I come from the place where we're considered subsistence farmers and corn growers. And yes, blue corn is still my favorite traditional food, and it's still something that my family grows today. And I don't know, our seeds are really old. Like I think it was like 45 generations. It's a very old world in Cochiti.
And this question actually maybe builds a little bit on that. Marcy, the cultivation of heritage foods is of growing interest. Even the New American Indian Museum in Washington, D.C. emphasizes regional native heritage foods in their cafe. In the native communities where you have lived, what are the key heritage plant foods and how are the seeds preserved?
So we have seed keepers. I think in every traditional culture, whether you're like in a community or a family, like there are seed keepers. Unfortunately, seeds are, I think, epitomize the different epistemologies of the two different systems, because in one, seeds can be commodified and altered very quickly. In the other, seeds are considered sacred. It's literally holding life in your hand. And it should be, and it's treated as such. And so when it comes to seed keeping, like now it's become a very secretive and important process. Like we don't tell people who our seed keepers are, because we don't want them inundated with requests. And we have very important seeds, very old seeds. And and just a quick comment about heritage foods. Heritage foods, like when we look in the marketplace, have been gentrified. Some have been gentrified. When we look at like seaweed products, when we look at, heirloom seed, like fruits and vegetables, if these came from an indigenous community and have been put in the marketplace, like there are issues. If the indigenous people don't have those dominating their food system, don't have access to them, yet they're on the market for like $20 a pound, there's a problem. Like that's gentrification. And we see that a lot with heritage foods. And that's one of, the things I did in my previous life. I worked on seed patents or fighting seed patents, and that again is another webinar. But yes, heritage foods, blue corn, very old forms of corn come from my community. And cotton, there's actually a study that came out that said 98% of the DNA came from upland cotton, which is the cotton that comes from my community to central Mexico. And so marketed cotton actually came from this era, which is cultivated by people in my community. So like cotton is a very important crop in my community.
Wonderful. Would love to have you back for a conversation about seeds sometime and patents and yeah.
Oh, it's a fascinating conversation. I would love to do that. Let's talk seeds.
Could you say a little bit more about kind of moving from that broad term of TEK or traditional ecological knowledge to focusing more regionally on specific peoples on the land?
Yeah, well, I think this is a characteristic of America. And of course, I've never been anywhere else. Like I'm born and raised in Cochiti, like Indigenous on one side, very Indigenous on the other side. Like I am of these lands, of Indigenous. So when we talk about America, like really it's the influence of policy. Like there's only so much you can say and do in like 100 pages of legislation. And so some of these broad stroke terms like American Indian, TEK, even agriculture, right, are terms that kind of develop some place to describe an entire field when really the beauty is in the nuance of those things. And so when we talk about TEK, it's like we're really talking about a relationship of a people to their land and how that land has influenced the patterns and production practices of that land. And so people want to study TEK, but I often tell people, you know what, you need to really just engage with the community that's closest to you to understand what those principles are and what those practices are and how to frame your thought around production and land capacity and resource management in that particular place. So when I think about my place, which has no water, we grow dry land. So that means like we are very much dependent on the rainy season and the like arroyo flows. And I think about the San Juan Islands where you have water all around you, like it seems like heaven, but those are going to create very different cultural and production practices. And that is the TEK, living in that environment and working with that piece of land and part of the world to the point of balance. That's what TEK is. But you can only know it if you are from a particular place and dedicate yourself to land. And this is what I mean when we say land people, is that like, if you have been in a place for 5 generations, like you know something about that place, you have responsibilities to that place. Like it's not only a responsibility of Indigenous people to care for a place. Like there are relationships that are being built that require people to respond to what the land is telling us.
Thank you. Take one more question here, and that's, how might we bring some of this awareness into the wider world, into the world of agriculture, or simply into the communities?
That is a very good question. I really believe in the power of people and individuals. Like, yes, we're part of communities. There's this really cool story in my community about ants and about how like they're really pitiful by themselves, but like they can carry like twice their weight. But when you get them into a colony, like that's when you can see them literally moving mountains. And so when we talk about how to challenge very inaccurate historical narratives around agriculture, part of it is like we have to insert our individual voice into that conversation and offer something new. And perhaps if we all do that, in whatever environment or conversation you find yourself in, maybe the mountain will start to move.
Well, thank you. And then I just have one more kind of question is, so when you talk about the 4th agricultural revolution, do you imagine the need for an entirely new system, or are there ways to adapt and build on. How do we go from where we're at to a future? Is it a matter of a completely new system, or is it a matter of building or changing or evolving the systems and institutions that we work within already?
You know, to be honest, Brooke, like it depends what day I wake up on. Some days I'm like, we need to tear the whole thing down. We need to start over. Like, how do we get out of this mess? And really, I say we as in the collective we. Like, yes, I come from an Indigenous community, but our communities are very much dependent on like the communities around us now. And so there's times where I'm like, we need to tear the whole thing down. And there are other days where I'm like, you know, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like there are probably some good things in agriculture that we definitely need to maintain. But for me, like it comes down to land access and stewardship. Like if we live in an institution that is dominated by one kind of person and like 98% of the land is owned by white men, like something needs to happen, and like it needs to happen quickly, because that only allows one perspective to really control how we practice this institution of agriculture. And so I think there's so many answers to. I don't have an answer to that question. And like I said, like some days are more hopeful than others. And really, like I don't want to tear down an extension anymore. I was like, I just want more extensions to be like this one, like San Juan Island extension. And so I will go to sleep thinking that tonight, and hopefully like that will infuse more hopeful reactions about agriculture in the future. So I think it's a day by day thing for me, but I don't have a good answer to that question.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess just wanted to ask you, and thank you again so much for your time and your gracious words, and just being so fun to work with and to share your experience with the community. It's been truly an honor, and just wonder if you have any closing words that you'd like to share. And we can.
Yeah, well, in closing, I think when I say in the beginning, I said I honor the people of the land. Like I honor you all too. Like you are in a very special part of this world. I told you I studied the maps, and I was like, I'm going to go visit this island. I'm going to go visit this island, because the information and the conversation that came from this group during this time, I'm a firm believer that we reflect the lands we come from. And all I can say is like, gosh, how beautiful this place is. And part of that comes from the conversations from the people and the words of the people, not only the Indigenous people, but the conversations. And I just hope you appreciate your land and your community as much as I do. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much to all of our participants. Just wanted to hand it over to Kate for one last final send off here. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. As we close out the summit this evening, I'd first like to extend our gratitude to A-dae for sharing her knowledge and voice with us. And I think Brooke has already shared, or I share the same sentiments as Brooke, that it has been an honor to work with you and have you here at the summit, and to close the summit, to really wrap up the conversations that we've had in such a meaningful and beautiful way, and to help us think to the future on how we continue these conversations and impact our communities here and wherever our participants are tuning in from. So truly, thank you. And secondly, I'd like to pop the evaluation into the chat. So if everyone can just click on that link, we'd really appreciate you sharing your feedback with us. And I've also included a question for San Juan County participants to let us know if you'd like to continue having or have a community conversation later this spring to really digest and figure out how the conversations of the Ag Summit impacted you, how they're impacting how you think about land and agriculture. So please let us know. And lastly, just to close out tonight, I think I can safely say on behalf of myself and the Ag Summit Committee, I'd like to say it's been an honor to create space for the voices that we've heard during the summit, and we look forward to continuing to build relationships and being consciously inclusive when we develop future Ag Summits. So thank you everyone for participating, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening. So long.